Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the New Deal era and the presidency of FDR. In the previous lecture, we concluded a discussion of the Second New Deal and the popular acts of that era. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about his re-election in 1936 and some of his actions of his second term, including the biggest misstep of his presidency up to that point, the court packing scheme. By 1936, when FDR was up for re-election, he was riding the New Deal acts to unprecedented heights of popularity. The New Deal stabilized the unemployment problem and the national economy, although, as we've mentioned, it had not resolved the problems of the Depression itself, but it certainly helped. You also might recall that in previous lectures I've mentioned the hundreds of thousands of people working for the CCC, the millions employed by the Civil Works Administration and by the Public Works Administration. Millions of Americans felt a personal attachment and loyalty to FDR, unlike anything experienced by other presidents. His fireside chats were delivered in warm and friendly style, in plain language, and even though he came from a wealthy Northern family, he managed to connect with people all across the country. In one fireside chat, he told Americans, "Tell me your troubles." Within a week, the White House had received more than 450,000 letters, many of which FDR read personally, and most of which were replied to directly by his staff. They reflected this personal attachment felt by most Americans. Also, Eleanor Roosevelt was much beloved by the American people. She traveled the country talking personally to many Americans and bringing back to FDR the stories that they told. He rode this popularity to an absolute landslide victory in the 1936 presidential election. The core of his support has come to be known as the Roosevelt Coalition. And this coalition, in one form or another, would form the foundation of the Democratic Party from this era in the 1930s all the way into the 1960s. You might think about those who were benefiting the most from the New Deal programs. It primarily was built around the urban masses and industrial workers, but also many minorities and ethnic groups, middle-class homeowners, farmers, and African Americans. While it's an overstatement to say that everyone benefited from the New Deal and FDR's programs, it certainly touched all regions of the country and most demographics across the country. In the 1936 election, FDR defeated Alfred Landon of Kansas, who is really nothing more than a note of trivia at this point. He really didn't have much opportunity to campaign, and opposition to FDR and the New Deal didn't present a realistic opportunity because the New Deal was so popular. FDR, despite his elite upbringing, created an image of himself as champion of the common man. And indeed, he won a huge victory in this election. Almost never before have we seen an electoral map like the one on the screen. He won every state except Maine and Vermont. There had been a saying prior to this that went, "As goes Maine, so goes the nation," because Maine had sided along with the winner in the presidential election virtually every time. But after this election, the saying was changed to say, "As goes Maine, so goes Vermont," the only two states that voted against FDR. FDR won a huge majority in the popular vote, 27.75 million to about 17 million for Landon. And the electoral vote was even more one-sided, 523 to 8. It was an absolute landslide. And yet FDR understood there remained much work still to be done. In his second inaugural address, FDR said, "I see 1/3 of a nation, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." And he set about to address the problems that still confronted much of the country. So what did FDR do with the enormous popularity and power that he possessed after the election of 1936? Well, in short, he squandered it, making his gravest misstep as president, embarking on what has come to be known as the court-packing scheme. So after the election, and with huge majorities in both houses of Congress, FDR set about to try to remove the most potent enemy of the New Deal to that point, the Supreme Court. As mentioned previously, some of the most prominent first New Deal acts, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and the National Recovery Administration, were overturned by the courts. In the cases Schechter versus U.S., the infamous sick chicken case that I described in a previous lecture, and the Butler decision, which overturned the AAA. Now, FDR understood that the acts of the Second New Deal, which had installed lasting social reform, acts like the Wagner Act and Social Security, would soon be tested before the Supreme Court. And he could not stomach the thought that these acts, which represented aid and assistance and reform for tens of millions of Americans, might be overturned by the handful of people on the Supreme Court. So let me talk just a little bit about the court at the time of the court-packing scheme. So first I would note that there's nothing in the Constitution about the number of seats itself on the court. It had changed several times since the beginning of the country. There were originally 6 justices. For a time it had been changed to 10 and then to 8 and finally settled at 9. But it had been more than half a century since there had been a different number than 9 on the Supreme Court, and it was a firm social practice, if not a constitutional rule. FDR referred to the Supreme Court as the 9 old men, and in particular to 4 of them as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These were the 4 arch-conservative members of the court. Willis Vandervanter, appointed in 1911 by Taft, a Republican from Wyoming. James McReynolds, appointed in 1914 from Tennessee. George Sutherland, appointed in 1922 from Vermont. And Pierce Butler, appointed also in 1922 from Minnesota. These were the arch-conservatives that, it seemed, would support the conservative side of any decision simply out of their own political leanings. There were also 3 liberal justices on the court. Louis Brandeis, a 1916 appointment by Woodrow Wilson. Harlan Stone from New York, appointed in 1925 and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Benjamin Cardozo, a 1932 Hoover appointment. That meant there were also 2 swing voters who were more in the middle. Charles Evans Hughes, who had at one point been governor of New York, appointed in 1930, and Owen Roberts, also appointed in 1930. So when we think about FDR's problems with the court, I suppose it's important to note that there really wasn't a conservative majority on the court at all. There were only 4 of these so-called arch-conservatives who seemed opposed to FDR and the New Deal just on political principle. Most of the decisions were close ones, 5-4 or 6-3. In any case, FDR deeply resented the Supreme Court for the rulings against his New Deal programs and set about to change that with his court-packing scheme. So the plan proposed by FDR proposed that for each justice over the age of 70, that FDR would be able to appoint an assistant or helper, an assistant justice on the court. Now, this would have allowed FDR to appoint over 50 federal judges total, including 6 more Supreme Court justices. This would clearly have increased the power of his presidency and also would give liberals a clear majority on the court. As you can see in the cartoon on the screen, the thinking was that he would surely appoint members to the court who sided with his political views. And in fact, in the cartoon, if you look closely, there are 6 FDRs who are the new assistants on the Supreme Court according to this plan. So we would have had a Supreme Court with 15 members, 6 of them new appointees of FDR, and of course they would have overwhelmed the 4 arch-conservatives on the court at that time. FDR is at the height of his powers at this time and of course had many allies who supported his contention that this would ease the backlog of cases that confronted the courts. It would ease their caseload. And there is some truth to that. The courts had been moving very slowly, and there were many cases waiting for months and even years to be heard. They also argued that the Supreme Court had become too powerful, that again, just this handful of men had overturned actions that were helping and supporting millions of Americans. And yet FDR was somewhat surprised that many of his allies turned against him on this action. And of course his opponents spoke out vigorously against it. Among their concerns was that FDR as president would become something of a dictator, having huge majorities in Congress, and then if he had this huge majority on the courts, there would be essentially no separations of power. Many of his allies in Congress were also frustrated that FDR had sprung the plan upon them without consulting or warning them. In fact, many members of Congress first heard about the plan in a fireside chat that FDR presented to the American people, and they were disappointed and frustrated that he hadn't consulted with them first. So, despite FDR's vigorous campaign to try to have this plan won over, it did not pass through Congress. And this marked the first significant setback and defeat of FDR's presidency. So FDR had lost this important battle over control of the courts, but ultimately he would win the war. What I mean by that is that the ultimate goal of this whole plan was that the Supreme Court would not overturn the acts of the New Deal. And for a couple of different reasons, none of the other acts were overturned in time. And Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Wagner Act were all upheld when they were tested in the courts. Part of what began to happen was that some of the aging members of the court began to retire, and in the longer run, of course, some of them passed away. The swing votes on the court began to uphold the New Deal measures. There were, recall, some legal technicalities behind the Schechter case and the Butler case that represented legitimate legal decisions as opposed to political stances. And in the longer run, FDR ultimately appointed more justices than any other American president in history, appointing 9 justices and replacing virtually the entire court over the rest of his presidency. So most important for his ultimate purposes, the New Deal acts, as they came up for further question before the court, were all upheld. With that said, though, the court-packing scheme represented a significant misstep, and it was the first point in a series of missteps that beset FDR's second term. In fact, he never again approached the soaring heights of popularity represented by the 1936 presidential election. In the next lecture, we'll talk about a few other episodes of his second term that began to remove some of the shine from FDR's presidency.